On today's Zoffy, we're going to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, which is Alberta energy politics. And I have to say one thing about the UCP government under Jason Kenney. They produce a lot of very interesting Alberta energy politics. And to talk with me about that today is Professor Keith Brownsey, political science at Mount Royal University. So welcome to the Zoffy, Keith.
Glad to be here, Markham. It's my privilege, actually. This is fun.
Yes, it is, but we'll get into that later. So Keith, the way I want to start this is to go back to the election campaign, during which, and this is the 2019 election campaign, March and April of last year, and Jason Kenney had what I thought was a brilliant energy narrative. It was pipelines, jobs, and the economy. And everybody was worried about jobs, of course, and the Alberta economy. It had been suffering for probably the last 5 years. And so the narrative was very, very well received. The UCP hammered on it all throughout the campaign, and Rachel Notley's NDP had no response to it. I think they were completely swamped by it and never mounted a real response to it. So that's my take on there. What's your take?
I think the last election was all about the economy. And what is the economy in Alberta, if not oil and gas exploration, production, distribution? That's what we're about. That's Alberta. And Jason Kenney came in, and he never said this explicitly, but it was the implication was there that he would win the election and all would be right with the world. The very next day, the day after the election, people expected to tune into the local news, read the morning paper, and expect multi-billion-dollar investments again in the oil and gas sector. That didn't happen. And in fact, that whole program that the UCP put together hasn't worked. It's collapsed in on itself. Kenney and his political staff thought this was 1993, 1995 again, with rising oil prices, with lots of support in the country for the oil and gas industry, with an economy that would recover. But none of that's true right now. And they find themselves in a mess. And it's just watching them, they don't seem to know what to do next other than slash and burn. And we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about education, universities, all of that.
Well, let's talk about where Jason Kenney got his support within the oil and gas industry, because I think this is a very important point that's not well understood.
There you go.
It was not within the big oil sands companies. It wasn't. No. He would not have a lot of support in the boardrooms of Suncor, of Husky Energy, maybe in Innovates, because Alex Pourbet seems to be a fan, but CNRL maybe. But not a whole lot. His support came from the juniors and the intermediates. Those are companies that produce under 100,000 barrels a day, and the service sector, which is very, very conservative as a rule. And there's lots of little companies out around in rural Alberta, and then the finance sector. And we see people like Brett Wilson, and so that's where he got it from. And what they have been under terrific pressure for a number of years now. And if you look at it from their point of view, which is mostly conventional oil and gas production, and the service sector has not really changed much. It's tied to that kind of production. They really do still think it's 1995. They think climate change is a hoax. They think that the energy transition is either a hoax or wildly overstated. And they think that if they change government, they can get rid of the policies that are hindering the industry, and they can go back to what they know and the money machine that they used to have. That's my take on it, Keith. What do you think?
I think you're absolutely right. I think there was this idea out there, if the UCP is elected, they're friendly towards the oil and gas sector, especially the intermediates and the small producers, and all will be right with the world. But golly, it hasn't worked out that way. And I think we can make an argument that Rachel Notley and her government, very bright in so many ways, understood that and was working to transition the oil and gas sector to a new ecosystem. to a new situation where oil and gas is important. It's never going to go away. It's always going to be the largest, at least in my lifetime, the largest economic sector here in Alberta, but that things have changed.
Well,
and
you know what?
they really have changed. I'll give you a short story.
Oh, please.
Just quickly. Back in 2018, I went to see Morneau, Rob Morneau, and Rachel Notley announced the purchase of the Trans Mountain expansion, or Kinder Morgan Canada. And I'm sitting at a table with, as you put it, people who are from the oil and gas sector, but the service sector, and they were livid that the federal government and the province stepped in and purchased Kinder Morgan Canada. It should have been left to the private sector. So I looked at this one fellow who was ranting away, and I said, you know, it would just be shut down if the federal government and the province hadn't moved in and bought the damn pipeline. And he said, no, that's not true. It's their policies that forced us into this. And I thought, boy, this is so 1993. It's ridiculous. It was 25 years out of date.
Now, that's very interesting, because I've written numerous columns about the politics and the policies and the legal challenges and all of that behind Trans Mountain expansion.
Yep.
And I can say that, in fact, Rachel Notley, supported by Jason Kenney in 2018, essentially laid the groundwork. They took the bait from John Horgan, and they created an environment in which Horgan said very clearly, we cannot, the one risk that we cannot bear is interjurisdictional conflict between governments.
Yep.
So if governments are going to fight over this project, that is the one thing that will make us exit. And Kinder Morgan, and on top of that, Kinder Morgan had serious debt problems, the parent company in Houston. And all of that combined to make them very anxious and very eager to get out of the project. So the idea of the private sector carrying it forward, unless another one of the pipeline companies came forward, it just wasn't going to happen. And I think that Trudeau, essentially, between all of the two governments in BC and Alberta, and his own political problems, because remember, Quebec was very leery, was sending out signals that it didn't want to see the federal government assert its constitutional authority. All of that, and I'm giving you like the Coles notes, because this is an hour-long conversation to properly explain all the politics around this. The federal government really had no choice, and that situation is so poorly understood in Alberta, even by the people within the industry who are working on the project. I mean, you can find Enbridge, you can find people like in Enbridge and so on in SEPA who don't know the facts, don't understand the details. Anyway, I'm rambling on here, so I'll wrap it up.
No, that's perfectly true. And the anger against the federal government and the New Democrats in Alberta was profound. And yet here they were spending billions of dollars. It's remarkable.
Yes, I mean, they spent $4.5 billion to get it, another $10 million earmarked to finish construction. All of that to the benefit of Alberta oil producers, and yet they're taking political flack for it.
Absolutely. But not only on the Alberta front, but they're taking political flack. The Liberals were very worried about losing seats in Vancouver. And they were convinced that maybe 2 or 3 seats, they would keep 2 or 3 seats. They did much better than that. Nevertheless, they had some serious political concerns on the other side of this question. So it was a remarkable time, and I just kept shaking my head and thought, I'm not dealing with rational human beings here. Their dislike of any state, as we say in academics, or government action is just profound, and I don't know why. Because the oil and gas sector is ultimately dependent on the state in just so many different ways, from regulation to taxation to various supports of one type or another. I mean, think of the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology, the Southern Alberta Institute as well. What do? They train workers for the oil and gas industry. Yet, the Kenney government comes in and is cut funding. to Nate and Sate.
Well, I'd like to get your perspective as an academic, because this can't be the only jurisdiction where the government, the primary industry, the business leaders are kind of living in this fever dream that's unmoored from political reality. And are there case studies of other jurisdictions? Is there theory around this? What insights can you give us?
Well, you have to go, and I don't like to do this, but you have to go to Appalachia. And I think that maybe look at Detroit, what's happened there with the decline of the automobile sector. Look at Appalachia right now, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, with the decline of the coal sector. That's our future if we're not very careful. I mean, the joke around Calgary right now is we could become another Winnipeg. Now, Winnipeg's a delightful place and I like it, but it's not the center very much. As someone told me the other day, Calgary right now is like Winnipeg after the Panama Canal was built. And I think that's not a perfect comparison, but there's something to that.
Right. But why is it, if you can give us your opinion, that the leaders within the industry, backed up by the UCP politicians, aren't looking outward and understanding the energy transition, not understanding the importance of climate change and the climate policies that are coming down the pipe from the Trudeau government? And it's all of the environment in which the Alberta oil and gas industry is operating, both the political environment and the policy environment, has changed so rapidly over the last 5 years, and will change even further over the next 5 to 10 years. And yet the leadership seems to think that they can stem the tide by pushing back and being, with these, with the war room, the $30 million to an Alberta war room, or the $2.5 million to an Allen inquiry. We're going to, debunk the foreign funded activists and keep them at bay. It seems like the leadership has in fact failed the industry.
Oh, I would agree completely with that. But the industry, again, certain parts of it certainly support the UCP, certainly support these politicians who really, if they stuck their hand out in front of them, couldn't see it because they live in such a dense fog that they don't recognize how things have changed and how quickly things are changing. Now, I'm not saying that, as Elizabeth May did, and I thought it was at best silly, oil and gas is done. It's not. It's anything but. But it's going to have to change in a lot of other ways if we want to sell our product outside of this country, or even within it for that matter.
Well, here's a question for you. Last week, the Suncor CEO, Mark Little, and Alberta Innovates CEO, Laura Kilcrease, co-authored an op-ed in the Corporate Knights magazine where they said, look, we think that there's a very good chance the drop in demand we see for oil during the pandemic may be our near-term future. They're really worried that demand's not going to come back. And so they argued for a pivot to beyond combustion, bitumen beyond combustion, to making carbon fiber out of materials, which coincidentally 2 months ago we put out a big paper on that. But here's the thing that really stuck out for me from the political point of view is Little and Kilcrease called for federal leadership on this file. And given the enmity between Trudeau and Kenney, mostly from Kenney, I really thought that was extraordinary. What's your take on that?
Well, it is extraordinary, but I think they understand. What have we dropped? We've dropped about 20 million barrels a day in consumption, from 111 down to 91 million barrels a day. And that will continue for an awfully long time. It's not going to go away. And that's partly COVID and partly transitions to other forms of transportation, other forms of energy. Let's put it like that. And so I think there's something there. And when you see the argument for transitioning to materials production, carbon fiber and the rest of it, what that indicates that you've got a mature industry here who's looking at a lot more than simply drilling a hole and pumping oil. That's That's the way to go. That's really smart. And I think that's where Alberta's future is. On the other hand, Alberta Innovates, and one of the co-authors of this, I'll say information rather than opinion piece, is the chair of Alberta Innovates, which is their budget's been cut by 40% by the province. They've laid off any number of staff, mainly in Edmonton, but some of their other satellite offices around the province as well.
Yeah, well, let's pivot a little bit and talk about the Allen inquiry. So the foreign funded activist trope was bandied about prior to the election. It was a big theme in the election. It's entirely based upon the research of Vivian Krause, the Vancouver-based blogger, whose work I debunked last May in a 9,000-word deep dive. Since then, Sandy Garasino from the National Observer has published a 4-part series explaining from the foundation's point of view how foundations work, because Vivian completely misunderstood all of that. She had the foundations as leading this charge. You know, they want to shut down the Alberta oil and gas. International foundations don't work that way. It's kind of preposterous. But anyway, that's the basis for the inquiry. The final report's supposed to come out July 2nd, and they've hired Steve Allen, who's a forensic accountant from Calgary and a big UCP supporter, to head this up. And the problem is no one will talk to them. No one will talk to them from the environmental groups. No one will talk to them from the foundations. They're trying to have these back channel conversations with people who shared it with me, and I won't say anymore, but they're desperate to get some information, and they're spending all kinds of money. And I don't know what they're going to come up with, because where do they get their data from? From Vivian would be the only response. So, and yet that trope continues as almost as strongly today as it did last year. Alberta is the victim of this international plot to, by foreign entities to fund activism against pipelines and against Alberta. What's your take on all of that?
That has a long tradition in this province, going back to Aberhart in the 1930s, William Aberhart. And it's blame somebody else, blame the federal government, blame, as Aberhart said, the 50 big shots, blame various ethnic groups of one sort or another. Then now that's not what Vivian Krause is about, but it's in the same general category. It's a taxonomy there that has resonance in this province. And I'm sure there is legitimate there's a legitimacy to this argument in some sense, but it's not just on the environmental side. It's large corporations, foreign-owned, large donors from offshore, and here we think about the Koch brothers giving money to various institutions or groups in Alberta, in Canada, to fight the socialism that they see creeping in here. So it's on both sides, but I think Ms. Krause has missed the boat here. Environmental groups, many of them would like to shut down the oil and gas industry, but there's no need to panic about that. They simply can't.
Yes, exactly right. And one of the points that gets lost in all of this, and so I interviewed 15 environmental groups and foundations that were involved in this, and they told me that approximately 85 to 95% of the funds that they get, that they use to fund their anti-pipeline activism, came from within Canada.
Oh, absolutely.
The amount of money they got internationally was a very, very small part of their budget. And after 2015, when Rachel Notley brought in the climate leadership plan, that actually slowed down to a trickle, because the foundation said, well, why are we funding? What we wanted was for Alberta to have climate policy. Now they've got it. Why would we continue to fund this kind of opposition? And so the funding went down from $4 million a year down to less than $1 million, which in this game is a pittance. I mean, it's basically somebody's coffee fund. So let's do a little pivot from the Allen inquiry and talk about the Fair Deal panel, which reported last week. Recommendation number 4 was some kind of vague, weird thing about getting collaboration between jurisdictions and shareholders, so that somehow Alberta can get access to Tidewater. And it's like, okay, the federal government having exclusive jurisdiction is somehow not sufficient. Now we want to go next door to BC, and we want to negotiate with the Horgan government and all of the First Nations there that have unceded territory and don't have, and we want to negotiate with them somehow to come up with an agreement. Like, that seems wildly unrealistic to me.
Completely unrealistic. It just isn't going to happen. The federal government in interprovincial and international pipelines is the regulator. They have complete jurisdictional authority, no question. And within Alberta, it's the province. But as soon as you go across the boundary into British Columbia, it becomes federal jurisdiction. So you're not going to negotiate with John Horgan and the New Democrats out there. You're going to get your license from the federal government. Now, layer that on to disputes with Indigenous peoples and their land claims and their own internal politics, which are a real mess. They'll never be anything but. And so you've got real problems there with trying to get anything built, such as a pipeline or, my God, a bridge or some sort of processing plant. It's very difficult to do. It's multi-layered governance that's becoming increasingly complex every day.
Here's another point I think that doesn't get made. I actually am writing a deep dive on this and pointing out that from the time that Trudeau announced on November, I think it was 17th, 2016, that the two pipeline projects, Trans Mountain Expansion and Line 3 replacement, were approved, and then he allowed Keystone XL approval to continue after Trump put the project back on the table in 2017. Throughout all that time, the federal government under the Liberals have done everything by the book. They have defended their jurisdiction. They have won every court case that has every judicial review. And the Alberta seems to want them to come in and take a big stick and smack BC and put them into line, whereas the government did what it was supposed to do. It defended it in the courts. It defended it in the court of public opinion. And the Alberta demands, and this industry is really bad for this, seems so unrealistic. I mean, do none of these people ever, read a constitutional scholar or, legal analysis of who has authority and how this, it boggles the mind, Keith, the uninformed analysis that I see in Alberta all the time. Your take, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're completely right there. What was the federal government going to do but follow process? That is their obligation. And the process says you have to consult with First Nations. You have to consult with the Indigenous communities along the way. You have to have stakeholder involvement, whoever the stakeholders are, be it construction unions or local governments or local community organizations. You have to engage with environmental groups. That's all part of the process. You just can't come in and clear the brush and dig a trench and plant a pipeline. That is so 19th century. It just doesn't happen anymore. And take it back a step. The Keystone XL, it should have been going years ago. Well, it's all done in Canada. It's all good here. Where's the holdup? You think it's bad to get something built here, try doing it in the United States, outside of Oklahoma and Texas. And nobody cares about those places.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I interviewed Professor Victor Flatt from the University of Houston. He's an energy law professor. The U.S. has the National Environmental Protection Act. It's been around for decades. And that's what the environmental groups and local communities, indigenous groups down in the U.S. are using to block, to frustrate TC Energy and its construction of KXL. And there's no way around that. Not even Trump cannot change that legislation. Only the two houses can do that, and they have chosen not to. And so this idea, and again perpetrated by Vivian Krause, that somehow no pipelines are protested or opposed down in the U.S. is complete and utter nonsense. I mean, it just doesn't accord with reality. And Professor Flatt told me that, in fact, every pipeline that crosses a state border is protested and litigated and opposed. And yet somehow these myths continue to have traction in Alberta.
A number of years ago, I was sitting in a restaurant, and we had a speaker up from the United States, a lawyer, and she was very proud of the fact that they had just had a court injunction against a piece of heavy oil equipment moving from the United States into Canada. And there was stopped at the border, not by the Canadians, but by the Americans. Can we really allow this piece of equipment to go across the border? It was eventually settled, of course, after 3 months, and thousands of dollars worth of litigation fees. So that's the real world right now. And it's not going to get any simpler. It's only going to get more complex. And the oil and gas sector just refuses to navigate that.
Yes, I think that, and this is going to be our last question. So if everybody who wants to ask a question can put your hand up so that we can start calling on you in a few minutes, it'd be great. And that, Keith, I don't understand. I still, it's a mystery to me. As much as I interview experts in the Alberta oil and gas industry and academics like yourself, pay attention to the politics, I still don't understand how the Alberta industry and the UCP government, for that matter, can miss all of these huge changes that are going on in other countries, the big trends in the energy system, global energy system, the changes in politics around energy infrastructure in other countries. It's almost like they don't pick up a paper and read, other than the Calgary Herald. So what is the underpinning of that Calgary bubble?
It's ideology and it's economics. It's their livelihood. The foundation of their thinking is the young guy who's maybe early 40s now, has been working for 15, 20 years in the oil and gas sector, and he's out of work, and he's been out of work for 3.5 years. He was making $125,000, maybe $150,000, bought the house, has a nice truck, all the accoutrements you could think of, and he's angry. They appeal to him. They appeal to him in the same way that Donald Trump appeals to coal miners in West Virginia, coal miners in the Appalachians more generally. It's that working class element. And here I get into deep, social science, and I don't really want to. That's who supports the UCP, and that's who the UCP speaks to. You have several people within the government, literally in cabinet, who spent a great deal of time in the United States in 2016 working for Donald Trump. Vivian Krause is worried about donations to the environmental movement from the United States. I'm worried about the Trumpkins coming north and changing our politics. I'm very concerned about that.
Well, just before I get to Michelle's question, I'll leave you with this thought. For the last 20 years, social conservatives in Alberta, primarily in Calgary, have been bringing up a Republican campaign training school from, yep. I forget, it's the Virginia's the
Liberty Institute.
Yeah, and they come up and they've been training social conservative activists for 2 decades. Yep. And so there are people in dozens, maybe hundreds, in Alberta who have been trained in Trump-style election tactics, campaign tactics, and now we're seeing, in my opinion, we're seeing the impact of that on Alberta politics, and that has something to do with where the UCP gets its support. Okay, well let's open up the Zoffy to questions. So Michelle, if you can unmute your mic and ask your question of Dr. Brownsey, please.
Hi, thanks, Dr. Brownsey. That was really interesting. One thing that I'm quite curious about is how can we change corporate culture a little bit to get some of these resource executives out? They don't get results. They use ancient management tactics, like all this culture of fear. I mean, most Alberta voters are victims of workplace abuse. Like, the culture in oil and gas is terrible. And it just seems like all the economic mechanisms that are supposed to be rational and results focused aren't.
Well, I mean, that's a much larger critique. Businesses like this. I mean, we were all taught growing up that the stock market was rational, weren't we? Your mic is off. It doesn't work like that. It just doesn't work like that. And yeah, there are very progressive firms in Alberta. I mean, Husky, Suncor. Markham was speaking of these two corporations a little earlier. But there's this whole group in the mid to small category of oil production that aren't. They're completely reactionary. And as good social scientist, I have to say that part of the object of any government, any state, is to protect its most important industries. There's the argument out there that these industries would simply self-destruct. And it's the state's role, the government's role, to protect them literally from themselves. And it goes back to the 19th century. The coal mine, the colliery owners in Britain were told that they were going to have to implement a 10-hour day. And they were outraged at this, absolutely outraged. It's the state interfering. And Disraeli, a conservative, comes along and says what? He says, if you don't, the whole system will collapse. And you'll be out of everything if you manage to survive this. Well, the toxic work culture in Alberta is, well, one of those things that the state needs to regulate.
Michelle, a couple points from Energy Media's point of view. We have been working on developing new energy narratives around Alberta, for Alberta. And I think one of the ways we can change things is picking up those narratives and amplifying them on social media and in our day-to-day networks. The second thing, I'm convinced now that shareholder activism is going to be increasingly important going forward, because shareholders at the end of the day are the only ones who can put pressure on management teams to change their tactic, to accept greater climate risk and climate reporting, to acknowledge that we may be in a low price environment long term, those kinds of things. I expect, and I may be naive in this, I expect a lot more of that with the bigger companies. I'm not as optimistic for the smaller companies because they're more closely held. And so in the smaller companies, they may have to go bankrupt to get rid of those executives out of the industry.
We're seeing that now. We're seeing a massive shakedown in the oil and gas industry, and the COVID price decline has just sped it up by perhaps 2 to 5 years. We're seeing every week half a dozen new companies file for bankruptcy. It's a tragedy. It really is sad, but that's the reality of this.
Well, let's get Dave, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Sure. Just I don't know, Keith, if you've read Condoleezza Rice and Amy Zagart's book on political risk.
Nope.
I'm just wondering, Markham, if that's something you would want to send copies of it to Kenny and his cabinet, and then maybe leave. I mean, managing political risk takes leadership, time to ensure alternative points of view are heard and rewarded. You have to be brutally honest about the political risks your business confronts. I mean, this is just normal stuff now in the political risk management thing, and Alberta just seems immune to it. Sorry. And I'm from Manitoba, and Pallister's pretty hard-nosed guy out here too, but still, it's just grim. A great read, though. If you get a chance, pick it up. Definitely a good read. Okay,
Keith, if you want to address that.
Well, it's all about risk management in politics. And Jason Kenney and company have decided that this is where they're going. They're really the protectors, the advocates for the medium and small oil and gas producers. The large producers, I'm sure, are on side, but not quite in the same way. They have a broader worldview that understands the transition that's going on. Not just a transition from fossil fuels to renewables or non-polluting fuels, however you want to describe it, but to who has to be involved in the larger conversations. And the small oil and gas producers haven't understood that. It's complex, it's time-consuming, and it's expensive. And who's going to be left at the end of all this, at the big shakeout? It's going to be the Suncors, the TC Energies. It's going to be the Huskies and all the rest, MEG, for instance.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We're getting short on time, so Val, if you can unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Okay, well, I have several, but I'll just ask one more current. I think, like, my opinion is that Kenney, he doesn't know anything about the oil industry, and he's just using it for his political purposes. But what he's doing, he's concentrating on things like destroying the public healthcare system and public education. And is he doing this of himself? Is he, part of a conspiracy to do this, led by Stephen Harper, whatever, as, some people suggest, or is he just basically busy looting the place while he can?
There's no conspiracy here. It's just how these people, the current government, thinks. It's their ideology, and they're committed to this. And they don't have to talk about it. It's nothing that they've sat down and charted out. This is just how they believe the world is and how it should be if it's not.
Well, Keith, maybe we should point out too, and I know we have a few folks here who were active in the Progressive Conservative Party, and Brian Heidecker would be one of them. Maybe he wants to chime in. But this is essentially the old Reform Party, the old Wild Rose Party that has taken over politics in Alberta under the UCP banner. And this goes back to Preston Manning in the mid-90s, the early 90s. This is not new stuff. These folks have been working for a long time to get the upper hand in Alberta. Am I out to lunch, or have I got it correct? What do you think, Keith?
Well, that's exactly what I think. And a very good friend of mine in the same business I am says exactly that. This is the Wild Rose Party. It's the Reform Party in office at the provincial level.
Right.
That's it.
Maggie, if you could unmute your mic and ask your question, please.
Keith, that's really interesting stuff. Some things I hadn't thought about. So to me, this increase in polarization in Alberta is one of the strongest sort of tribalism kind of creating things that is going on in Alberta right now. And so, here you are, you're a social scientist, right? And yep. You understand what's going on here, but that message doesn't seem to be getting to the people who need to hear it in a way that they can understand it. And so my question is how academia could be addressing UCP policies more publicly and in really understandable but accurate language. I'm wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, that is up to academics to get busy and to do something on this. There are proposals out there right now for a book on this massive blue wave, but it's trying to understand it. And a lot of people believe that the UCP are simply a populist government of the far right, much like the Trump administration in the United States. And that if we look at that model, it explains much of what we see here today. There's a wonderful story going around that a minister was going to visit some of the groups that his department supports, academic research. And the executive assistant walks into the room. There was a nice buffet and there were posters and all of the science types were there ready to explain things. And the executive assistant goes around and says, these two posters have to come down. And why? They mentioned climate change. Climate change was in the paragraph. That's who you're dealing with. Climate change deniers. Okay, that's fair enough. But really not even to engage in the debate. Not open enough to understand that most people think that it's a serious problem. Nope.
So that's one example. That's one example. I get it. And I get that's who you're talking to. And in the face of that, like seems to me that there's something that academia can be more active in public discourse, like I say, in simple language, and I don't see it happening, you know? I'd
It's
love
not
to see
there.
it happening.
No.
What can we do about that?
Well, I don't know. People like me should sit down and write the opinion editorial piece, the op-ed piece for the Calgary Herald or the Globe and Mail. We're just not seeing that occur. Markham, this is where his genius lies, is that he does this sort of thing. He tackles these issues head on. And I've nothing but admiration for that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I'm struggling simply to find out how Jason Kenney makes decisions. What's the cabinet process that he has in Edmonton? That's my little niche in the summer of 2020. The larger questions, such as you raise, that's a big deal, and I'm not sure I would want to tackle it right now. I mean, we should be out there doing interviews now and putting all the information together and trying to understand who these guys are and why they're the way they are.
Okay, we're going to wrap up fairly soon, but I want to put in a plug for Tuesday's office. We're going to have Professor Monica Gattinger from the University of Ottawa, who is a specialist in political narratives, energy narratives, and has written extensively on the polarized Canadian discourse. And she's going to talk about how to bring people together in the middle, and I think that's where Maggie was going with her question.
Yeah.
And the point the way I'm going to frame it for Monica is that even though I come from sort of a centrist position, I've chosen to be more confrontational than she would be. I've chosen to, sort of pick up the cudgel and go to war with the Brett Wilsons and the, Cap and people like that. Because I think that the people in the center who believe in evidence-based policy, who accept the climate science, those kinds of things, I think they needed a champion. I think they need somebody to stand up in public and say, this is not right. The science says this, the evidence says that. And, Tim McMillan of CAP, you should be fired. And, so-and-so, Jeff Tonka, you're wrong. Somebody needs to do that to counter the existing narratives. Now, I've tried to put myself in that position, but I don't have the megaphone that the Herald has or the CBC has. But from my point of view, Maggie, I think that we need more champions who are willing to take on that status quo head on and provide alternative narratives around energy that are more in tune, more aligned with the energy transition and climate change and where we're the future instead of the past. So there we go. That's I'm afraid we've come to the end of the Zoffi. So thank you very much, folks. Thank you, Keith, for
You're welcome.
Being a guest. We'll have you on again in the future, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody on Friday. I haven't got a guest yet, but I've got a couple in the pipeline, and I'm sure we'll have somebody very interesting. So thank you very much for this.